They didn't bother lowering their voices. The lawyer had barely finished clearing his throat when the whisper slid across the polished table like it belonged there. She got nothing. It wasn't said cruelly. That almost made it worse. It was stated the way people confirm the weather, or the time on a clock. Certain. Final. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Practiced. My nails pressed half moons into my palm, but my face didn't move. Years of being overlooked had taught me how to disappear in plain sight. My stepmother didn't look surprised. She dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue she'd prepared in advance, then leaned back in her chair like the hardest part was already over. My half-brother didn't even try to hide his smile. He stretched, crossed his arms, and stared at the ceiling as if calculating upgrades. No one looked at me. The lawyer continued reading, his voice professional, detached, as though he were listing office supplies instead of dismantling a life. The house. The accounts. The personal effects. Every item landed somewhere that wasn't my name. And to his daughter, he said, pausing just long enough for hope to flicker before killing it, there are no additional provisions. That was it. No explanation. No apology. No acknowledgement that I was sitting 6 feet away, breathing, listening. The room exhaled. Chairs shifted. Pens clicked. Conversations restarted in low tones that grew louder by the second. Well, he must have had his reasons. She was always distant. You can't expect anything when you barely show up. I stayed seated while they rewrote my story for me. I let them agree that I wasn't worth planning for, that I'd failed some invisible test no one ever explained. What they didn't see was the way my heartbeat steadied. I stood slowly, smoothing my skirt, forcing my legs to cooperate. The lawyer glanced up, nodded politely, already moving on. To him, I was a closed file. I walked toward the door with measured steps, aware of every sound behind me. The scrape of a chair. A muffled laugh. Someone whispering my name like an afterthought. She really thought she'd get something. I didn't turn around. In the hallway, the air felt cooler, sharper. I paused there, just long enough to breathe without an audience. My reflection stared back at me from the glass frame of a forgotten certificate on the wall. Composed. Unbroken. Empty enough to fool anyone. They thought this was the ending. They thought I was leaving with nothing but embarrassment and grief. What they couldn't hear, couldn't imagine, was the quiet certainty settling into my chest. The knowledge that the story they were telling each other was incomplete. By tomorrow morning, their whispers would still be circulating. But so would something else. And unlike their assumptions, mine was already in motion. I didn't need them to understand it yet. I didn't need proof, validation, or sympathy. I only needed time. Time to let them underestimate me, to let their certainty harden into carelessness. I had learned long ago that people are loudest when they think the story is finished. That belief makes them reckless. It makes them blind. As I stepped toward the exit, grief finally surfaced, but it wasn't for what I'd lost. It was for how confidently they'd dismissed me, and how certain they were that nothing would follow. By the time they realized their mistake, the silence they'd given me would have done its work, and I would no longer be standing where they left me. That was the part they didn't plan. I learned early what it meant to exist on the edge of a family. After my mother died, the house changed in ways no one announced. Her photos disappeared first, quietly replaced by neutral art and smiling strangers. Then came my stepmother, efficient and polished, carrying a sense of order that had no room for grief that lingered too long. She brought rules. She brought schedules. And she brought a son who fit perfectly into her vision of what our family should look like. I did not. At 12, I became an extra chair pulled out only when guests arrived. At 13, I learned how to clear plates without being asked. By 14, I understood that praise was currency, and I didn't earn enough of it to matter. My father noticed, I think. But noticing is different from intervening. He worked longer hours. He avoided conflict. He convinced himself that silence was the same as peace. Money entered the conversation early, always framed as responsibility. We had to be careful. We had to plan. We had to prioritize. Those priorities never included me. When my half-brother needed tutoring, the funds appeared. When he wanted summer programs, they discussed travel. When he crashed his first car, they replaced it quietly and blamed bad luck. When I asked about college applications, my stepmother smiled sympathetically. "You're independent," she said. "You'll figure it out." So I did. I worked evenings after school, weekends during holidays. I learned how to stretch meals and ignore exhaustion. I earned scholarships and pretended they were choices, not necessities. At home, I became agreeable, easy, low maintenance. I learned that the less space I took, the less resistance I faced. It wasn't love, but it was survivable. Family gatherings made it clearer. I was introduced without context. My achievements were summarized vaguely. My absence from conversations went unnoticed. "She's doing fine," my father would say, as if that explained everything. By the time I moved out, I had stopped expecting fairness. I didn't resent them anymore. Resentment requires hope, and I had learned to live without it. What I didn't know then was that my quiet competence was being observed. Not celebrated. Not defended. But noted. Years later, when my father's health began to falter, the call didn't go to my stepmother first. It came to me. Not because I was the favorite, but because I was reliable. "Can you help me organize some things?" he asked. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't reconciliation. It was trust, expressed the only way he knew how. I said yes without hesitation, unaware that this was the first time my place in the family would quietly shift. What I didn't understand yet was that being overlooked had prepared me for exactly what was coming, and that everything I'd learned while standing at the edge was about to matter. I had spent so long shrinking myself that growth felt almost dangerous. I trusted routines, not promises. I trusted preparation, not reassurance. While others relied on belonging, I relied on readiness. I didn't know what form it would take, only that one day my steadiness would be required. Every ignored effort, every quiet sacrifice, every night I handled things alone had sharpened something inside me. They mistook my silence for weakness because they had never needed to listen closely. I was learning patience, structure, and restraint long before anyone thought to call it strength. And when the moment finally arrived, I wouldn't need permission to step forward. I would already know how. That knowledge would change everything sooner than anyone expected else. When my father's health began to fail, it didn't happen dramatically. It arrived in small omissions. Missed calls. Unpaid bills. A cough that lingered longer than it should have. He dismissed it all, but something in his voice changed, a thinning I couldn't ignore. The call came on a Tuesday evening. "Can you come by this weekend?" he asked. "I need help organizing some things." He didn't say finances. He didn't say accounts. He said things, the way people do when they don't want witnesses. I found him at the kitchen table surrounded by folders that smelled like dust and time. He looked relieved when he saw me, then embarrassed, like asking was a failure. I sat down without comment and began sorting, the way I always had. At first, it was ordinary. Deeds. Insurance statements. Old tax returns. Then the categories shifted. LLCs I didn't recognize. Investment summaries mailed to a post office box I'd never heard of. Accounts listed without my stepmother's name. I didn't react. I asked neutral questions. I labeled tabs. I made spreadsheets. My father watched quietly, saying little, but his shoulders eased as order returned. "You're good at this," he said once, not meeting my eyes. I shrugged. "Someone has to be." Evenings stretched into weeks. I became his unofficial archivist, arriving after work, leaving when the house went quiet. We spoke around the work, not about us, but about logistics. about where things were kept, about contingencies. One night, long after the files were stacked neatly, he slid a thin envelope toward me. "Read that," he said. Inside was a trust amendment. Specific. Deliberate. My name appeared where I hadn't expected it. I felt my chest tighten, not with excitement, but with caution. "This isn't signed," I said. "I know." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The document said enough. It corrected imbalances without announcing them. It bypassed conversations he didn't want to have. It was quiet, like him. I waited for instructions. He didn't give any. Instead, he asked me to keep helping. To make sure everything was current. To verify beneficiaries. To confirm access. I understood the unspoken agreement. I would prepare, not presume. I would protect his intent, not advertise it. Weeks later, his hands shook more noticeably. One evening, after rereading the document himself, he signed it slowly. No ceremony. No witnesses. Just ink settling into paper. He handed it back to me. "Keep it safe." I nodded, aware of the weight I was accepting. Not just financial but moral. This wasn't a gift. It was responsibility. After that, he rested easier. And I worked harder. What I didn't realize then was how invisible our arrangement was. How completely it escaped notice. They saw a tired man and a dutiful daughter. Nothing more. They never asked what we were doing at that table. They never wondered why I was there so often. They never imagined that the person they underestimated was quietly becoming essential. By the time his condition worsened, everything was in place. The folders were complete. The accounts aligned. The trust rested where it belonged. And the favor they would never acknowledge had already been granted. That understanding stayed with me as I locked the files away, knowing silence was part of the design. Preparation was the language we shared, and it asked nothing from anyone else, especially those who assumed they mattered most, certain their presence defined importance while my absence did the real work, patiently, invisibly, until the moment it would surface, undeniable, irreversible, and complete. The will reading felt staged, like a performance designed to reassure everyone already confident of the outcome. I sat in the same chair, heard the same words, watched the same reactions, but my perspective had shifted. I knew there were two stories unfolding, and only one was audible that day. They believed the will was comprehensive, final, and fair because it looked official and sounded complete. Legal language has a way of silencing doubt. It gives people permission to stop asking questions. They trusted paper and signatures more than patterns, habits, and the quiet logic of long preparation over time. I watched my stepmother perform grief with careful precision. She dabbed her eyes, sighed at the right moments, accepted condolences she had rehearsed receiving. My half-brother shifted impatiently, already bored, already calculating. They saw inheritance as reward. I understood it as timing, alignment, and patience earned through restraint alone. No one noticed how calm I was. They mistook it for resignation. In truth, calm was camouflage. Panic would have raised questions. Anger would have invited scrutiny. Silence protected the boundary between what they believed and what had already been secured elsewhere, beyond discussion, beyond approval, beyond their reach entirely. The will they heard was intentionally simple. It distributed visible assets in predictable ways, reinforcing assumptions already formed. It created closure where curiosity might have grown. What it did not include were structures designed to operate without witnesses, mechanisms activated automatically, and decisions finalized quietly long before that morning arrived. I had learned enough by then to respect invisibility. The most effective arrangements rarely announce themselves. They wait. They rely on procedure, not persuasion. While everyone focused on what was said aloud, I focused on what had been filed, verified, and positioned to move without commentary or external approval needed. At the funeral, the same pattern repeated. People approached me with sympathetic expressions, speaking slowly, gently, as if I were fragile. Their kindness assumed loss. I accepted it without correction. Grief is easier to perform when it matches expectations, and my role required restraint for reasons I couldn't share then. They spoke freely around me, revising history in real time. Stories sharpened, faults reassigned, absences exaggerated. I listened without interruption. Letting people narrate their version reveals how certain they are. Certainty breeds carelessness, and carelessness leaves doors open longer than intended for those watching patiently from shadows nearby and waiting. My father's absence felt heavier in those moments, not because he was gone, but because his intentions were misunderstood. He had chosen discretion over debate, correction over confrontation. I honored that choice by allowing the misconception to stand, knowing accuracy would arrive independently without my voice forcing recognition later publicly. When the lawyer closed the folder, it sounded like an ending. People relaxed. Futures were discussed. Plans formed confidently. I stood and left quietly, carrying a different conclusion. One that required no witnesses and no defense, only time and precise execution to reveal itself beyond that small room eventually alone. Outside, the hallway smelled faintly of polish and paper. I paused there, not to mourn, but to recalibrate. The narrative they embraced freed me. Underestimation removes pressure. It creates space. Space is where preparation matures into certainty, and certainty transforms quietly into irreversible outcomes later without spectacle or explanation required. By the time they finished whispering, the machinery was already moving. Their version ended there. Mine did not. It advanced silently, fueled by preparation and restraint, toward a moment they had confidently declared impossible, unaware that endings announced too early are rarely accurate, especially when silence has been carefully planned. I went to the bank the next morning before the city fully woke up. The sky was pale, undecided, like it hadn't chosen a mood yet. I liked that. It matched me. Quiet. Controlled. Nothing on my face hinted at what sat inside my bag. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A television murmured financial news no one was watching. I took a number and waited, legs crossed, pulse steady. No one rushed me. No one knew this moment mattered. When my number flashed, I approached the desk and slid the documents forward without ceremony. The teller smiled politely, the kind reserved for routine transactions. She typed, paused, frowned slightly, then typed again. "I'll just need a moment," she said. That was when the silence stretched. She disappeared into the back, taking my paperwork with her. I stared at the counter, at a small scratch shaped like a lightning bolt, and wondered how many lives had shifted inches from where I stood. Money doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly, changing gravity without sound. A manager returned with her. He introduced himself, reviewed the documents carefully, then nodded once. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. He turned the screen toward me. $590,417.23. Pending. My breath caught, not from shock, but from confirmation. The number didn't feel like a reward. It felt like alignment. Proof that preparation had weight. That silence had value. "It should clear by the end of the day," he added. I thanked him and gathered my things. My hands didn't shake. My steps didn't rush. Outside, traffic moved as usual, unaware that something irreversible had just settled into place. My phone buzzed as I reached the sidewalk. A message from my aunt. "Hope you're okay. These things are never easy." I stared at the words, then slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Sympathy based on misunderstanding carries a strange comfort. It lets people reveal what they assume, not what they know. By noon, the deposit cleared. I logged in from my kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the floor. The balance stared back at me, unchanged by emotion, unquestionable. I closed the laptop slowly, as if sudden movement might disturb the finality of it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I made tea and sat quietly, letting the reality settle into my bones. This wasn't an ending. It was infrastructure. A foundation laid without ceremony. Somewhere across town, they were still discussing who got what. Still rearranging futures based on partial information. Still confident I was walking away empty-handed. I wondered how long it would take before certainty cracked. Before curiosity replaced confidence. Before someone asked a question too late. By evening, the city lights came on, and with them a calm I hadn't expected. Not joy. Not triumph. Just steadiness. The kind that comes when nothing needs proving anymore. They believed the story ended yesterday. Mine had just become liquid. I sat there longer, listening to the kettle cool, thinking about how easily people confuse visibility with value. They mistake volume for authority and presence for power. I had survived by doing the opposite. By stepping back. By letting assumptions calcify. Tomorrow, nothing would change on the surface. They would still pity me. Still whisper. Still move forward with confidence built on missing information. And I would let them. Because leverage works best when no one knows it exists, and the quietest advantage is time. I had plenty now, and for the first time, it belonged entirely to me. That truth settled quietly, finally unquestioned and irreversible inside me. The first crack appeared quietly, the way most collapses do. My stepmother called to complain about the house, about repairs that cost more than expected, about taxes she hadn't realized would compound so quickly. She spoke as if I was still on the outside, a listener, not a variable. I murmured sympathy and changed the subject. Weeks later, my half-brother posted photos of a new car, then quietly deleted them. A month after that, he asked if I knew a good financial advisor. His confidence had thinned. The certainty I'd watched at the will reading no longer fit him properly. They still assumed I was struggling. That belief insulated them. It made them careless. They spoke freely in front of me, lowering their voices only out of habit, not caution. "She's probably renting something small," my aunt said once. "She always lived within her means," my stepmother replied, almost kindly. I listened, nodded, and let the myth hold. Meanwhile, my life became quieter, not larger. I paid off debts without ceremony. I moved money with intention. I learned the pleasure of stability, of decisions made without fear humming beneath them. Nothing flashy changed, and that was the point. The second crack came when my stepmother asked to meet for coffee. She arrived tense, stirring her drink long after the sugar dissolved. She spoke in circles, framing problems as inconveniences, never naming the truth directly. "I just thought," she said finally, "you might understand how complicated things are right now." I did understand. Perfectly. I told her I hoped things worked out. I did not offer solutions. Her disappointment showed briefly before she masked it. She still believed I had nothing to give. That belief broke a week later. My half-brother called late one evening, his voice tight, his questions rehearsed. "Did Dad ever mention anything separate?" he asked. I paused, letting silence do the work. "He mentioned preparation," I said carefully. That was enough to unsettle him. After that, the calls stopped. Replaced by distance. By recalculation. They began to watch me instead of past me, searching for evidence they had missed. It came too late. The final request arrived months later, stripped of pretense. My stepmother's voice shook as she asked if I could help with a short-term loan. Family, she said, meant supporting each other. I chose my words with care. "I thought the will made things clear," I replied. The line went silent. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. Softer. Uncertain. "I didn't realize," she said. "That's true," I answered. "You didn't." I hung up gently, without anger. Watching them struggle didn't bring satisfaction. It brought confirmation. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits until assumptions collapse under their own weight. They had mistaken my absence for irrelevance. My silence for surrender. And now, faced with consequences they couldn't explain, they were forced to confront the limits of what they knew. I didn't step in to rescue them. I didn't need to. Their downfall wasn't dramatic or public. It was quiet, incremental, and self-authored. And as their certainty dissolved, something else solidified. My independence. That was the real inheritance. I let that truth settle slowly, aware that distance was no longer punishment but protection. I had moved from the margins to the center of my own life, and nothing they said or asked could shift that position again. It was earned quietly, kept deliberately, and would remain untouched by their regret, confusion, or belated curiosity forever. That certainty never wavered after that. By the time we saw each other again, the tension had cooled into something heavier than anger. It was resignation. We stood at opposite ends of a crowded room during a community fundraiser neither of us could easily avoid. Small talk floated between strangers. Laughter rose and fell. No one noticed the history threading the space between us. My stepmother approached first. Her posture was careful, measured, like someone crossing ice she wasn't sure would hold. She commented on the venue, the weather, anything except the question pressing behind her eyes. I listened, nodded, waited. "You seem well," she said finally. "I am," I answered and meant it. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Your father, he was very private. About everything." I met her gaze. Yes. The word landed harder than she expected. She searched my face for confirmation, denial, relief. I offered none. Around us, glasses clinked. Music softened the silence without filling it. My half-brother lingered nearby, pretending not to listen. He had lost the swagger I remembered. In its place was calculation, cautious and late. He watched my hands, my expression, as if the truth might leak through posture alone. "I suppose," my stepmother said, choosing each word, "there were arrangements we didn't fully understand." "There usually are," I replied. That was all it took. Understanding settled like dust. She nodded once, not in acceptance, but recognition. The story they had repeated to comfort themselves no longer fit the evidence in front of them. "I'm glad you're doing okay," she said, meaning something different now. "So am I said again. She stepped back, returning to her circle with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My half-brother never approached. He left early, taking his uncertainty with him. I stayed. Not to prove anything, but because I no longer felt the need to disappear. The room felt neutral now. Safe. Ordinary. Later, as I walked to my car, I thought about how long I had waited for acknowledgement that never came. How easily I had mistaken recognition for closure. Closure, I realized, isn't something others give. It's something you claim when the noise finally stops mattering. They would keep wondering. They would replay moments, searching for signs. They might even rewrite their version again, softer this time, kinder to themselves. None of it required my participation. The balance in my account would remain unchanged. More importantly, so would my sense of self. I had moved beyond the need to be chosen, included, or explained. I had built something durable in the quiet they dismissed. As I drove home, the city lights blurred into a steady line, and I felt a calm that didn't ask for permission. The whispers had ended, replaced by a silence that belonged to me. I carried it easily, like something earned and finally set down. The story they told about me no longer followed. I had stepped out of it, intact, unburdened, and entirely my own. I did not look back as I turned the key, because nothing remained behind me that required explanation. Tomorrow would arrive quietly, as it always had, carrying ordinary decisions and steady progress. I welcomed that simplicity. It was the reward of patience. Whatever they believed now was irrelevant. I had learned to trust my preparation, honor my restraint, and keep my victories private. In that privacy, I found peace, momentum, and a future defined not by inheritance, but by intention. I walked forward certain, unafraid, and complete, knowing the quiet path I chose would continue opening doors long after whispers faded into lasting freedom. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.